Welcome, bienvenue to the G7 Insect Biodiversity Declines panel discussion, which is hosted by the Royal Society of Canada. I am Nigel Raine. I'm the Rebanks Family Chair in Pollinator Conservation at the University of Guelph, and I'm also a member of the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars. It's my very great pleasure to moderate this discussion today, and my pronouns are he, him, his. I wanted to start off with a quick land acknowledgement, acknowledging that the University of Guelph, where I work when we're not in a pandemic, resides on the ancestral lands of the Attawandaron people and the treaty lands of and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We recognize the significance of the Dish with One Spoon covenant to this land and offer our respect to our Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Métis neighbors, and we strive to strengthen our relationships with them. And I know that people are joining us from all over. So thinking about the relevant history and current situation of the lands that you're in. Now, it's my great pleasure to host this panel. We have some some excellent panelists, three excellent panelists. Dr. Alexandra Harman completed her BS in Environmental Studies at Washington University in St. Louis, and then continued on to the University of California, Berkeley, to do her PhD work under Claire Kremen when she was there. Since arriving at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, her work has focused on understanding the patterns and processes that govern plant-pollinator interactions and diversity in natural systems. She's particularly concerned with identifying how bees respond to various environmental disturbances, including habitat fragmentation, fire, grazing, and pesticides. Alongside her students, she runs a vibrant research and outreach program that has been awarded over $2 million to improve our understanding of limitations to pollinator conservation and restoration. Dr. Margarita Lopez Uribe is the Lorenzo L. Langstroth Early Career Professor and Assistant Professor in the Department of Entomology at Penn State University. She received her bachelor's in biology from the Universidad de los Andes in Colombia, her MS in genetics and evolution from the Universidad Federal de Sao Carlos in Brazil, and her PhD in entomology from Cornell University. She's an evolutionary ecologist and an extension specialist in pollinator health, and her research focuses on the understanding how environmental change and human management shape bee health and long-term persistence of their populations, particularly in agricultural areas. Welcome, Margarita. And last but not least, Dr. Jessica Ware. She earned her bachelor's in UBC in Vancouver and a PhD from Rutgers University in 2008. She wrote a successful NSF postdoctoral fellowship, which she undertook at the American Museum of Natural History. And she was an associate professor at Rutgers University, Newark, for 10 years before joining the American Museum of Natural History this year during the pandemic. So congratulations, and that must have been a really challenging time. Her work focuses on dragonflies, damselflies, termites, and cockroach evolution using morphological and molecular data. And she received the Presidential Early Career Award in 2019. She currently serves as president of the World Dragonfly Association and was elected to the presidential line of the largest insect organization in the world, the Entomological Society of America, in 2020. So thank you to everyone for agreeing to be panelists on this important topic. And so I'd like to sort of start by asking some fairly open questions really about these questions. We're talking about insect biodiversity. We as scientists who spend our time thinking about these questions are very well versed in why insects are important. But for many people, insects are really not their most favorite organisms. They're not most favorite animals. People can be quite negative when you start to talk that you work on insects and bugs. Why should we care about insects, and why are they important? Dr. Ware?
Well, I think that, insects actually touch many aspects of human life, and people don't often maybe even really realize or appreciate the way that insects actually impact our day-to-day. So when we go outside of our homes, the reason why we're not tripping over undecomposed material, whether it be dead bodies or logs or branches, is because insects have done decomposition for us. They serve a very important role as decomposers. The reason why we're able to get, most of the 40% of our nutrition actually comes from plants that are pollinated by insects. Essential nutrients that we get from plants that are pollinated by insects. When we think about some of the luxuries that we have, whether it's, silk for fabric that we might use, or candles that we have in our home from beeswax, as well as food, that we like to eat that's kind of insect adjacent, like honey. Insects actually really probably have impacted everybody who's watching. They probably impacted your day in some way or another. So even if you don't necessarily have a positive visceral reaction when you think of insects, you should at least take some time to appreciate the way that insects actually have shaped many aspects of your day before getting to 5 p.m. Eastern time today. That's what I would say.
No, absolutely. From that sort of private perspective of just caring about food and food provision and those essential nutrients, we obviously rely on many insect pollinators. Something like 75% of the crops worldwide rely to some extent on animal-mediated pollination, and we know that the value of those crops is in excess of about 700 billion Canadian per year. So no, that's a really good reason. But those ecosystem services are clearly very, very important decomposition ecosystem services as well. We know that people's experience of insects kind of changes quite often depending on their age. So when I engage with children about insects, I know that they're usually really, really excited about them. And somewhere along the way, we kind of lose our excitement about insects as we move into adulthood. I mean, present company obviously accepted. Alex, have you had much experience with those kind of questions or those kind of barriers to talking about insects and why they're important?
I have, Nigel. I used to, with some colleagues of mine, run a camp that used to be called Girls Explore Biology. And we would have the students, the entomology department at the University of Illinois, bring insects in for the students to explore. And there's something that happens around the age of 9 or so, where gender identity really starts to set in, and then girls associate insects with being icky, and icky things are boy things. And then they really start to diverge, and you can see it in our group. We have, like, the younger girls are all over it, and the younger kids are all over it. And then just right around that, our age group would span just that age where girls start to really question it. But then eventually they would break out of their shells and just run and, have millipedes all over their faces and, things crawling all over them. And they just absolutely loved it. And so there's something that happens where children, I think, generally are very interested in insects, because I think partly because they're small and they see them often because they're close to the ground, and so they're very interested in them. And then something happens as they start to move into pre-puberty, where they just start to find them, they kind of move into this phase of being kind of gross or weird. Mm-hmm. And I think as adults, we often think of them as invading our spaces. And so then adults have this connotation with, like, oh, there are ants on my counter, ants are bad. And we kind of lose that respect for them even when they're in their own natural environments. When you're outside, people are still like, oh, there are bugs all around. I don't like that. And it's really a shame, because as Jessica mentioned, insects are just so important to us and play such an important role in our lives that without them, I mean, even if you don't love insects, if you love birds, or if you love any animals, right? So many animals actually require or need insects for food even. So if you love them, then you have to love their food source too, at least a little bit.
Yeah, we often think about that towards the end of the summer, particularly when the wasps get more abundant and start to bother us around picnics. We kind of maybe gloss over their role as pest control agents earlier in the season, and that they're really, really important. So understanding that maybe they're annoying us, but we're on their territory, so maybe we should be a bit more forgiving and tolerant. So we talk about insect biodiversity a lot and we talk about biodiversity. What do we mean when we talk about biodiversity? How many insects are there? What sort of where are they distributed, and how abundant are they? Do you want to take that, Margarita? Or should that go to Alex?
Yeah. So I think Alex may have. Alex, do you want to take that one?
Sure, Alex can take it. That's fine. My mistake. Sorry.
Sure, no problem. So, when we talk about biodiversity, we mean both the number of species that there are of insects, and then also how abundant those insects are. And we know that there are currently named about 1 million species of insects across the world, and that obviously is disproportionate in urban and Western areas. So, we know a lot of insects in North America, far fewer in various parts of Africa and other areas. So the named species are about 1 million. The estimate is that there's probably closer to 7 million total on the planet. Insects are one of the most, in the animal kingdom, they make up the largest by weight, the largest amount of biomass by weight compared to other animals. And they're incredibly abundant. I just looked this up because I figured that this would be a question that someone might want to know. But there's an estimate that there's 10 quintillion insects, individual insects on the planet at any one time. So, and if quintillion is 10 to the 18th power, right? So that means that there are a lot of them all around us all the time. And I think we can look past them often because they're so small, and a lot of them actually live underground. And so we're not seeing a good portion of the biodiversity for insects that are in existence. And when we think about where they're distributed, insects are very sensitive to temperature, and they need, many of them rely on plants. So they tend to, you see a lot of the highest diversity of insects in tropical areas or places that are highly diverse, have highly diverse plant communities. So that's kind of the distribution. Not that North America has tons of insects still, and even in the most northern parts of Canada, we get some interesting ones too.
It's so funny, Alex, whenever people ask me where dragonflies are found, which is one of the insects I work on, I always try and point out to them that, the northernmost Arctic, north of 66 degrees, actually has, there's 6 or 7 circumpolar dragonflies that live up there. So even very, very far north, we can see these really big, vigile, fast-moving insects. It's kind of neat that they seem to go from the tippy tips of the poles, towards the equator.
Well, and I wanted to chime in to share a fun fact about bees. So bees are super important. We have heard about bees because of pollination. And there was a recent paper last week actually showing that bees seem to show a different pattern of biodiversity globally. So unlike many insects that tend to have a greater diversity across the tropics because of these relationships with plants, bees tend to have these kind of they love deserts. And so basically the diversity of bees really peaks in areas that are really dry ecosystems, right? And so unlike many other insects or organisms in general, where we have this pattern of, lower diversity in the poles and then greater diversity in the tropics, bees seem to be a little bit of an exception to that rule.
Yeah, it's great. As you say, that paper came out just this week about the bimodal distribution of bees and the fact that we see that huge diversity, particularly of ground nesting bees in these desert environments, and that they're very inapparent, if that's a word. Yes. We don't see them because they spend most of their time underground and most of their time being dormant. So if you're there at the right time, there's huge diversity. If you're not there, it seems like there's nothing there in terms of those bees, which is really amazing, and it's a great place to go. You can end up with estimates of over 4,000 species in the United States of bees, many of which are down in the Southwest in those desert regions. Is that correct? Is that yes, a reasonable estimate of current diversity? I know there's a lot of work going on that, and recently launched. Would you like to talk a little bit about the monitoring efforts that are happening now in the US?
Sure. Yeah, I guess I think we're gonna kind of go full circle with this topic, right? But one of the questions that we have is, we know insects are very important, and we have, we're hearing about these declines, and we will discuss, some more details about that. But one of the major challenges with insect decline is that we don't really have a very good historical record of how abundant these populations and how diverse these communities were in the past. So to really have a strong evidence of decline, we're missing a big chunk of information. And this is why a lot of countries are really interested in starting to monitor populations, so that in the near future, we're going to be able to have better evidence of how widespread or localized insect declines are. So the US has just kind of started this effort. I know there are similar efforts in Canada. The UK has also very advanced monitoring programs. And yeah, I guess this is one of the first steps to really understand bee decline.
Yeah, documenting what's there and what was there is really, really important. So, I mean, we hear all the time when we engage with media about all the environmental challenges we face. And I mean, we see this also with wildlife and biodiversity generally. And even when we talk about insects, people are talking about the insect apocalypse and insectageddon, and the fact that there are these widespread declines. What evidence do we have about these declines, and how widespread they are, and how maybe they vary by taxa, for example?
Yeah, so I think this story really exploded. I think a couple of years ago, we started hearing about these calls for attention. Insects are in decline, and I just want to give the audience a little bit of a historical perspective on this, right? So when I was a child, I never thought we were going to be talking about insect conservation in the future, right? Because insects were, as we were mentioning before, these things that we think of, usually as pests. There are so many of them. They're invading our space, right? They are all over the place. They are not cute pandas that, are kind of threatened by, human activity. Year 2020, we have, already a handful of studies that indicate that, at least in terms of biomass, kind of total abundance of insects, certain parts of the world definitely have pretty, good evidence that there has been a dramatic reduction in the abundance of insects, right? So I think we do have some evidence of localized declines in some parts of the world. Specifically, I'm thinking of a couple of studies, one from Germany and one from Puerto Rico, where they showed that over 60% of the biomass has decreased in the past 20 years. And then we do have, for example, for bumblebees, a very specific group of bees, there has been, a couple of studies actually showing worldwide data. And there seems to be evidence of localized declines. Very few areas show an increase in biodiversity. And then some areas seem to be stable, right? So I think we don't really have very hard evidence to talk about, every group of insects. I don't know if everyone here, agrees with me, but I think the evidence is, starting to show up. And I think there is a call for, scientists to pay more attention to this and start studying these more directly. And for, everyone else, the public, policymakers to really, implement changes for conservation.
I mean, that's a really interesting point. I mean, we talk about the bumblebees and some of these communities of bumblebees showing some of those species becoming rarer and losing species richness in some of those areas, and ranges of some of those species contracting. But on the flip side of that, some other species becoming much, much more relatively abundant in those areas. So there are winners and losers in these changes, and understanding why some of these species are doing better and some of them apparently are doing catastrophically much worse, and that the changes for some of these species are happening very quickly. like from a Canadian perspective, if we look at something like the rusty patch bumblebee, going back even a few decades, it was a relatively common species around Guelph and other parts of southern Ontario, and we haven't seen one in over 11 years in Ontario and therefore in the whole of Canada, and it's become rarer in other parts of its range in North America as well. So I think that's a really important point. We talk about abundance of those species, and there've been a bunch of studies looking at biomass, as you've pointed out, as a very crude measure of the abundance of those organisms, but also the range size of individual species and how they may be responding to different types of stress factor. So if we're thinking about declines, what are we talking about when what do we mean when we talk about declines in terms of insects across the board? We've already pointed out that there are clearly knowledge gaps, but did you have anything to add to that, Alex?
Sure. So we're seeing the best studies that we've seen thus far on this issue of declines is looking at, has basically found declines in all aspects, declines in abundance, declines in biomass, declines in species richness, so the total number of species, and that they're thinking this is going to have really cascading effects on all of these other organisms that rely on insects. And then, as Jessica mentioned, the decomposition processes, like if you don't want to be tripping over biomass and you're, everywhere, all over everywhere you step, those processes are really going to start to break down if we don't have a rich and stable insect community and ecosystem.
Well, I mean, looking at that example, I mean, you were talking about that breakdown of products, moving cattle to Australia, for example, and not having the correct types of dung beetles there. Literally, you end up with a big accumulation of stuff you don't want to be standing in very, very fast if you don't have the right types of beetle. So that's just a really, really graphic illustration of the sort of unseen roles that these organisms play in different parts of our ecosystems, and providing those services for free. So the value of that biodiversity is huge, but very hard to calculate sometimes in terms fiscally in terms of that. So, yeah, I think that's really important, talking about the diversity questions, the distribution of those species, why they are where they are, and how they are changing over time. Clearly, we know that that's a very important thing that many of us are studying. In terms of the scales of declines, Margarita touched on some of those larger scale decline studies that have come out recently. What are the scales in terms of the different taxa, and where do we need to know more?
Well, I'm not sure if this would be a good time to jump in and give a plug for freshwater insects, but certainly, the data that, as Margarita mentioned, many of the studies that have, and Alex too, many of the studies have really focused on terrestrial organisms and kind of using certain styles of traps that are kind of set it and forget it traps that then collect, insects that fly into them, and then biomass can be measured. And that really doesn't work for freshwater insects. It's a kind of a different style of analysis that one needs to do, a different style of collecting that needs to be done. So there have been just a very, very small number of studies that have looked at whether or not freshwater insects, many insects have juvenile stages that develop in freshwater. And the few studies that have come out, they seem to be, kind of conflicting on whether or not freshwater insects are actually doing terrifically well, or whether or not they're doing abysmally poor. And so I think that, like for many of the terrestrial insects, we don't actually have true baseline data. So even to compare what species were there 40 years ago or 100 years ago isn't actually necessarily good baseline data. It's kind of a false baseline because we don't really know the pre-industrial kind of numbers that we had. We don't really know what the numbers of freshwater insects were in many of the locations that we want to sample in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s. So if we have a point kind of measurement that somebody maybe has sampled, a Swedish lake in 1990, we don't know whether or not that actually is good baseline. So for freshwater insects, and maybe this is true for the bees as well, for freshwater insects, it's very hard to compare what we have now because we don't really have anything to compare it to other than these kind of one-off, perhaps biased site measurements. We often tend to sample things that are easy to get to. So they have a good, bank along the edge of it that we can dip our nets into. So
would you say that on average, what we know about the changes for aquatic insects is less than what we know about terrestrial insects?
Most definitely. I mean, there are some insects like dragonflies, which are they're a very charismatic group. A lot of birdwatcher style enthusiasts, kind of document what dragonflies are where. So we know a bit more about what the adult stage, which is terrestrial. We know a bit more about the fact that they've expanded their range. They've shown up in places that weren't expected. But for many of the flies, for many of the small beetles, for many of the aquatic taxa, it's a mystery.
So we have the charismatic megafauna of the insect world. Sorry, Alex, go ahead.
No, I was just going to jump in. I find that really ironic because so many aquatic insects are used for like bioindicators of water quality. And so we know that they're really sensitive to like when the habitat gets really degraded, and people can actually use the presence or absence of these insects to tell us something about how the quality of the water. But the sampling is still, even with that knowledge, the sampling is not broad enough or often enough for us to actually use that data to say anything about, how aquatic insects as a whole are doing. They're saying, oh, this one species is not here, the water quality must be really bad, or it's really cloudy, and so they don't like those kind of conditions or things like that. But like, it really emphasizes the scale of the problem of understanding insect decline. It's like even groups that we know are important, that tell us a lot about how an ecosystem is doing, we still don't have the data on them as a whole, of their distribution, their frequency, their abundances, to be able to say anything more meaningful at the broad scale about how the entire community is doing.
I think that's a really interesting point, though, that we have sort of snapshots of these very visible species, like you say, the adult dragonflies. We don't know as much about the distribution of the nymphs when they spend. I mean, what proportion of the time do they spend in the water compared to as an adult, Jessica?
Well, of course, it varies by species, but some taxa can spend 2 to 5 years as juveniles. And so the bulk of, their time on Earth is actually as a juvenile, with just kind of one summer, a couple month period to disperse and reproduce.
And you see that
as top predators, I mean, it really kind of behooves us to if we want to understand the food web, we really kind of do need to understand how some of these top predators like dragonflies and damselflies, how they're responding.
And as you say, when we have these sort of selective snapshots from different places, and which may or may not be easy to get to, we know that when we look at data sets from the same sites over multiple years, the year-to-year variability based on a whole swathe of different factors is really, really big, or can be really large. So understanding how those communities change over time, if we have a data set that we have from 80 years ago and we have one now, and it looks like there's a lot fewer of those insects or a lot fewer species, then are we sure that really represents a decline or just 2 time points in a series? So that's obviously something we need to be very, very mindful of. So we've talked about declines, we've talked about how we might assess those. What are some of the things that are driving those declines? There's good evidence of different types of drivers affecting these different insect taxa. Who wants to jump in on that?
I mean, I guess I can start by sharing what I know about bees specifically, but I think, I think of bees as really an indicator group, right? Like that is telling us that there's a bigger problem that may be more widespread. So we know that in the case of bees, and again, this is true for mammalians, like birds, right? Like one of the major drivers of decline has been destruction of habitat, which has led to a reduction in the amount of available food, right? So there are fewer flowers in the landscape because habitats have been destructed. At the same time, also impacting nesting sites. So basically habitat, like for insects, as with anything else, like if you destroy that, then, that there's a huge problem there. But for insects, I think there is a major stressor that perhaps may be very unique to insects, and is that because of what we were discussing earlier, insects have been historically a group that we have, like wanted to control or, suppress, right? Because they can be pests. So we want to kind of like, get rid of them. We have been using very, very toxic pesticides for many, many decades. And even though these pesticides, of course, are needed for very, like targeted purposes in agriculture to control, for example, pests and have food, the reality is that these pesticides are not really targeted. And so what is toxic for a pest ends up being toxic for non-pest species. And, I guess, like there can be pesticides, like going to water and, impacting, for example, aquatic, like fauna as well. So that is definitely another major problem for insects, and specifically for bees. And so the combination, I think, of these, like lack of nutrition, or, like these poor nutrition and exposure to pesticides, I think is making also, specifically for bees, it's making them more susceptible to pathogens. So we not only have these kind of like poorly fed insects, and insects that are dealing with a lot of, like pesticides and chemicals, toxics, but that makes them more vulnerable to things that they have coexisted with for, like millions of years, right? Like pathogens are not something new, but now the individuals are just more stressed because there are other kind of abiotic factors driving this. And then I guess, a major factor that we are just starting to understand is, climate change, right? Like temperature is one of these things that, like impacts everything about how we function as, organisms, live organisms. And we don't really fully understand how climate change may impact the specifics of it, but we know that, it's such a fundamental aspect that it is likely stressing populations all over the world. I don't know if I missed anything, Jess or Alex or Nigel.
The only thing I would just say, which you kind of already touched on, is that there is this aspect of human vanity that really is impacting insects. Human vanity includes things like having to have bright lights shining on our homes, so that all of our neighbors can see how bright our house looks, which of course that impacts all of the insects that fly at night. The vanity of wanting to have a lawn that has, a perfectly green color without any spots. That vanity leads, turfgrass insects to largely be destroyed. So, there is this aspect of our own kind of pridefulness that actually directly impacts these communities.
I'd like to add to that, like just to remind the audience that because insects are ectotherms, right? The temperature, the climate changes in temperature and moisture are really going to affect them, right? Their entire developmental cycles are often predicted or affected by how warm it is or how moist it is and things like that. And so when the temperature changes, it's not just them being uncomfortable, it's actually them not surviving and not being able to do a lot of the really important basic functions that they need to do. And the other thing that we can't undersell is the synergisms between all of these effects. So they're affected. While they're being affected by climate, they're also taking in additional pesticides. There's also a reduction in food availability for them. There's also, light pollution that's affecting, where they're flying and how effective they are at just living their general existence. And those synergisms, I think we don't really understand them super well, but there's a really good example where in urban areas, because it's warmer, parasites do better. And so an insect living in an urban environment is more likely to have a higher parasite load, and thus probably be less likely to go on and reproduce just from living in an urban environment. So just by living in a warmer area, they're also going to have more parasites and thus this has all these downstream effects in their life cycle. So these synergistic effects are things working together to kind of really affect the number of species, their abundances for insects, I think can't be understated.
I think Jessica's point about the sort of vanity and the individual decisions we make is a really good one. That idea about lawns particularly, we know that lawns are a massive habitat. When you actually add up everyone's lawns that they can be really, really important. And if you have high levels of chemical inputs going into those which may have toxic effects, or even combining that with climate change and people wanting green lawns, this move towards plastic lawns to remove the need to keep watering the lawns, you're removing quite a lot of that habitat. Or the use of pesticides for controlling pests in ornamental gardens, where you're not making the same cost-benefit analysis vis-a-vis the controlling effect on a crop pest, which we need, as Margarita pointed out, for food production under some situations where you reach these thresholds that the pest needs control. When you're in an ornamental garden, then you're making a decision based on how the plants look, not on the amount of food that they're producing. So it's a very different sort of cost-benefit calculation that people are making there. So yeah, that's really important. I think also not underselling that the combinatorial effects of all of these different stresses. A lot of the research that people are doing, there's a lot of great research happening on different insect groups about how these different environmental stresses may be affecting them, but bringing those combinations of stress factors, which is the reality of these insects face, is critically important. And one of the knowledge gaps that we do have when we're trying to understand these declines. One of the things that really was very apparent to me when I moved to Canada in 2014, coming from the UK, where, as Margarita pointed out, there's extensive monitoring happening of pollinators, and there are some really long-standing data sets because they've been running in some agricultural stations, or they just reflect that there have been Victorian gentlefolk going out and collecting charismatic things like butterflies and bees for perhaps longer than in other parts of the world. That sort of longevity of data sets, they're much rarer, I would say, in Canada and the US, and certainly very rare in other parts of the world. Does anyone want to talk about any of the sort of geographic distributions of these decline data that we're seeing?
Well, certainly, I could just briefly mention that the Canadian government actually there has been funding to sample Ellesmere Island. There has been funding to sample kind of the northern latitudes of Canada, which are being dramatically impacted by climate change. But it's a small number of people going to do these sampling. And so as entomologists, I wouldn't say that I would be the best person to go and sample flies, for example. If I go, I'm going to catch dragonflies for sure, like 100% of the time. Well, maybe 90%. I catch some bees for Alex and Margarita. Nigel, if you'd like, I catch you something. But I mean, I'm going to focus on the taxa that are my specialty. And so when we have had these big sampling efforts, people have tended to focus on their expertise. So there haven't been a lot of studies that have focused on the majority of the orders. Some orders we know a lot about, or relatively more about, for these broad sampling efforts, and other orders are virtually undersampled or unsampled. So it really depends on the expertise, I think, of who's doing the sampling in these broad scale efforts.
And if I may chime in, Jessica, thank you for that comment, because you made me think about something that I oftentimes, have to remind people when they ask me, so why do you go, and spend so much time just, collecting bees? Like, why are you doing this, right? So I hope that people in the audience, at least, this discussion helps them understand why the funds, the federal funds, the public funds that are going to, these sort of basic research just to understand biodiversity are extremely important, right? And so perhaps not always there is a direct or quick link between, like the research that we're doing and some economic benefit for us. But understanding, like what we have is really, really important to, like have a good idea of how we're changing the landscape and how we can, mitigate some of these changes. So I think, like that's something that I wanted to mention. And the second thing is that when we're talking about distributions of insects and how widespread these changes are, we do see that the knowledge is very unequal across the world, right? And so there is, comparatively, there's a lot of funding available for research in developed countries, right? But the developing world is very different for all of this. So it's a major challenge, because if we think that these declines are really widespread and worldwide, we have very, very little capacity to really detect those changes in areas where there is not even, like funding to work on that. So, like there should be, again, like kind of like global efforts to really, tackle these questions that are, affecting everyone on the planet. So yeah, I guess, like something to open our eyes about how different parts of the world may have different barriers to like identify problems and solutions.
No, I think that's critical, isn't it? I mean, Alex already pointed out the fact that we have these many millions of species, and that they tend to be concentrated in tropical regions where we know much less about the situation, and let alone the numbers of species now, let alone the numbers that they used to be, or the relative abundance, and they are also super abundant. So detecting declines in something that's really, really abundant now is really much more challenging to do. And then we have the issue of most of these will be new to science, because we have maybe scratched the surface of that. Maybe we have identified 1 million species, and clearly there are many, many more that we need to look at, and some of them can be identified by eye, some less clearly. So that's another barrier. And I mean, working at the American Museum of Natural History, Jessica, what do you see as the value of those collections and the taxonomists that work in them?
Well, I mean, I think museums provide a lot to this kind of conversation. We do have these massive expeditions that have taken place over hundreds of years. And many of those expeditions, because of colonialism perhaps, were deposited in North America and Europe. So people who have access to those collections can use these collections to kind of look at these snapshots in time. It doesn't always tell you if something wasn't there, whether it was just that the person was having an off day, whether it was rainy, whether they didn't collect it for some other reason. But it does kind of give you a little bit of a snapshot. Okay, in 1921 in January, this is what they found on this particular island in the Philippines. I can go and access that. I can walk down the hall and go and access that. The people from the Philippines may not be able to access that because of like the historical processes, those samples were removed and are held in another location where they may not be able to get loans even. So to kind of build off of what Margarita is saying, I mean, we do have this kind of wealth, this amazing resource in the British Natural History Museum, in the American Museum, in the California Academy of Sciences, where have you, in the Royal, in Canada too, and at the National Museum. Who can access that and who can kind of tap that resource is still unfortunately rather limited. And I think that that's one of the things that we need to do more. Even in Canada, many of the people who are living in the northern latitudes, who have long history and rich historical knowledge that may not necessarily have made its way into some of the museums, finding ways to interact with Indigenous communities, with First Nations people about the changing environments, the changing food webs in their own communities is something that, museums in general kind of need to do a little bit better at, I think.
No, absolutely. And to add to that, there have been a number of sort of initiatives to try and digitize many of these specimen records, and that is opening up some of the access, or barcoding, things like the Barcode of Life project, which is publicly accessible. And clearly there are there are some of those initiatives, but that doesn't remove some of those sort of historical, as you say, colonial barriers to access to a lot of these different specimens. And that's going to be a barrier to progress on a global scale if we're thinking about this as a global and integrated problem, which clearly it is. So I think that's a really important point. What about training for systematists and taxonomists? Do you think that's an issue for us? You can go, Jessica, if you want. You look like you want to.
I'm bursting at the seams to say yes, it's a big issue. My goodness, there's some people have phrased this a taxonomic impediment. There's more species out there than there are people to describe them. What we need to train the next generation of systematists. We need to train and fund museum collections to do training in museum science. We need to make taxonomy, not be considered to be kind of a quaint historical science, but actually a really progressive and vital science. I think that many of the kind of entomological trends that we've seen over the years kind of moved a little bit away from valuing taxonomy and systematics. And then we have, the rise of things that we don't like bed bugs, and suddenly there's no one around to identify them because there hadn't been systematists, kind of trained in semicids. So, I think that people are awake. People understand the need for taxonomy, but what we need to do is to put some money in training and resources. And, tell your friends, tell your kids that this is a cool job to have, to be a taxonomist, to be a systematist. It's actually vital as crop protection, as vital as, vector biology, as vital as some of these other aspects of entomology that might get a bit more attention.
To kind of piggyback on Jessica's point, I study communities, bee communities, and one of the biggest complaint that we have, or limitation, I shouldn't say complaint, is that we don't have enough taxonomists to help us identify all of these species, right? We have some of them are really, really small, really hard to identify, or maybe never even described, and there's just such a backlog of species or of specimens that haven't been identified that really slow down our science. Like sometimes it can take years to get things identified to be able to answer questions. And so it really, if you're really passionate about conservation, like I am, like that, we can't know what we're trying to conserve because we don't know what's there, because we don't have the taxonomists and the expertise to even tell us what's there. And it's really a shame because it used to be such a vibrant field that was really well supported, and then and somewhere along the way, the funding shifted and the jobs shifted, and there was just a lot less support for museums. And it's really right now, when we're in this period where we're trying to understand what do we have, what are we losing, and we don't have anyone to tell us what do we have and what did we lose. It's really slowing down our work and slowing down our conservation processes, and that's really quite a shame.
Alex, when I was I'll just say a quick story that I had a colleague after graduate school, and she decided to switch taxonomic groups to study beetles. And there was one kind of world expert who studied these beetles, who is kind of the expert in their morphology and taxonomy. And she arranged to meet him over the summer. And he was elderly, he passed away. And with him was all of the knowledge for that beetle family. And so basically she had to reinvent the wheel. And I think that happens far too often.
Yeah.
And I think Alex's point also that's in a relatively well-studied group of insects. In the bees, that's still a taxonomic impediment. You move into areas or families or taxa where they're just so poorly described. You're starting with those real basics. So that puts things back even further than just years. That makes it almost impossible to do those kind of ecological studies that we know we need. And you talked about pest control and, emergent pests, emergent insect threats that we may face, understanding what they are and understanding what their likely ecology and behavior might be based on things that we know that are similar is also going to be really, really important.
Mm-hmm.
So we've talked a lot about biodiversity losses. We've talked a lot about declines and the various amount of information that there is around that. So being optimistic, we need to look at how are we going to improve the situation? How are we going to stem the tide of these declines? How are we going to conserve species, the ones that we can identify at least, and the ones that we know are declining? What are the impediments there, and what are some of the opportunities? Did you want to speak to that, Alex, a little bit, or?
Oh, sure. I love this topic of what can we do, right? Because I love to end everything on a high note, right? Especially in 2020, we need as many high notes as we can get. And I think that I'm excited to see how much press that insect declines are getting. I mean, because I wanted to mention this earlier, but like people have been sounding an alarm about insect declines since the 60s, right? It's in Rachel Carson's book about Silent Spring. Like part of her whole story is that we're losing the insects. DDT is killing off all the insects. It's affecting the birds. And so people have known that insects are declining, at least anecdotally, for a very long time. And so what can we do to help is really looking hard at our actions, the things we do out of vanity, how we keep our yards, the things that we do out of convenience, like, how we source our foods. A lot of the overuse of the conversion of a lot of habitat is to feed animals. Like, do we need to eat so much animal meat, so many animal products? That's not really, it's not good for you. It's not good for the environment. It's definitely not good for the insects, because we're taking habitat that could be natural and wild out of production for, so that we can have an extravagant, and I don't mean to belittle those that don't have enough, because there are people who don't have enough, but unfortunately, right now we're in a place where we're producing we have more people who are overweight and obese than we have people who are underweight, which means that we actually are producing enough calories. And if we make sure that we're allocating those calories well, allocating that land well, right? It's not just the calories that we eat, it's like the land that goes into making those calories. Is really important to helping us address these insect declines. I think that there is, so we think about, those are the kind of personal things that we can do, but then also like advocating for change, advocating for parks to have more natural areas in them. Some parks I live in Champaign-Urbana, and some of the parks now just have like big prairies in the middle of them, right? And that's wonderful for insect diversity. It's also really good for climate change. So we have to not just think about the insects, but when we put habitat back on the land, like wild areas back onto the landscape, that is good both for our climate and for the insects and for the birds and the, small mammals and all of these things. That's really just good for our planet. And so we have to think more broadly about what kind of world we want to live in, right? Do we want to live in one that is really uniform and has really perfect lawns, but is really hot and uncomfortable and devoid of diversity? Or do we want to live in a beautiful, rich, diverse world that has a stable climate and lots of both insect diversity and diversity of other sorts too? And those things can't be unlinked. And I hope that people will at least take the first step of looking at their yards, where they live, and their food and how they source it, right? Is it could you have less meat in your diet? Could you have more organic foods if you can afford them? Could you have more local foods if you could afford them? And those things will help us transition the land, transition the landscapes, and hopefully start to help address some of these insect decline problems.
I think
that's, go ahead, Jessica, please.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think too, Alex, since you touched on food, I couldn't help but mention, one of the things that we could do is actually start eating more insects, because entomophagy is the idea of eating insects. It doesn't have to be as just a beetle on your plate. They can be ground up into flour. They can be used for other sources of protein. But actually, entomophagy is a really efficient protein source, a really efficient source for fat. So there are ways where we can actually use insects to kind of help combat insect loss, if that makes sense.
They're much more efficient ways of creating animal protein than farming many of the sort of mammals and birds that we do at the moment. So yeah, that's a really interesting key point. And I think the point about food is also well made in that as diets evolve and change, particularly in the first world, that we are increasingly dependent on insects for pollination. We know that the area of insect dependent crops is increasing year on year, so we're becoming more and more dependent on pollinators than we ever have before. So this idea, we have this mismatch of production, we have enough calories, they're in the wrong places, we have large amounts of food waste, and all of those are having impacts on the level and the intensification of agriculture that we're seeing. So these are all key questions that have an impact on insect conservation. I thought Alex's point is definitely there about stacking the different ecosystem services. So it's not just good for insects, it's good for birds, it's good for all sorts of plant communities, that when we're getting those benefits, we're getting multiple benefits. So it's not just convincing people that they should support these beetles or these bees or this butterfly, although clearly that can work effectively as well. So I mean, we see that, and that seems to be one of the things we need to be kind of maybe a bit more explicit about when we're thinking about conservation. What are our aims? Because we know for some examples that there are species that are becoming rarer, and in some cases they're getting protection. We've seen that with some species in the US and Canada and other parts of the world, where we start to go through a process of listing them through IUCN processes and similar things like that. So you end up with some sort of conservation designation. And then those species often get quite a lot of attention. Does anyone have any experience of working on species at risk and wanted to say anything about those? Jessica, you look like you are keen to say something, no?
We can't hear you.
Oh yeah, we can now.
Okay, I would just say that there are very few dragonflies and damselflies that are listed as threatened or endangered, but there are a couple. And one of the ones that we've been working on in the Arctic has, have steadily decreasing amount of habitat availability, since it lives in lakes that have the bottom of the lake, which is permafrost. And as the permafrost melts, the lake tends to disappear. And it's very interesting kind of working on a taxon whose habitat is disappearing, a taxon who's disappearing. You go from one year to the next, and your field site looks completely different. The abundance of your specimens are completely different. And comparing our work with some other Canadian researchers, the Cannings brothers, who have done a lot of sampling in the Yukon, their photos from when they were at the same site compared to what we see, totally different.
Very interesting, absolutely. I mean, we see, for example, things like species at risk, like the very significant declines we've seen in migratory monarch populations. That's obviously really captured a lot of public focus and imagination around both monitoring and creating milkweed habitat for the oviposition for the adults to the females to lay eggs on. What opportunities are there for citizen and community science to support conservation and support research, do we think? It seems like there's a lot of a buzz around that. I mean, and excuse the pun, but yeah.
Yeah, so I guess if I may chime in, because there is something that I wanted to attach to this comment. There are many ways in which, like you as a citizen can be involved in helping insects, right? And so I guess Nigel, we should have had some sort of like page with links or something like that, right? But I guess one thing that I would like to emphasize is that it's very important to be very well informed before one, jumps into trying to help and ends up doing the wrong thing. So I just want to give you a couple of examples of, how sometimes these efforts have ended up in, pretty disastrous, effects. For example, with the whole bee decline, right? Everyone wanted to help the bees. So we saw this explosion of new beekeepers, right? Everyone wanted to buy bees and keep bees. It turns out that, honeybees are really kind of like agricultural, like bees, right? Like they are really designed to either have them for, honey production or for pollination services. They are not native. They are, like social insects that are, like tens of thousands of individuals in every single colony. So every time that you bring a honeybee colony into a new area, you're having a pretty major impact on the habitat, right? So by trying to help the bees, many people have actually, like taken actions that have not really helped the native bees. And so that's, and I really wanted to give a shout out to Sheila Kola, who has been working on these conflict between native bees and wild bees in Canada. And there are similar examples with monarchs, right? Like people have been buying any milkweed and it turns out that for the monarchs, different types of milkweed are actually very different and, like have different impacts on, like larval development and, so, like you need to really be well informed. Like I invite you to take action and, like help. But do, like some research and, reach out to the, people that are leading the projects and really finding out, like how you want to help. So I don't know if I think that's a positive note, but, like being careful.
Yeah, absolutely. Being careful and making sure you involve all the people, people who are looking after the land and making sure that they are incentivized to support insects as part of that stewardship. And that might mean paying more for food if we're dealing with farmers and seeing where that value stream is coming, to not expect people to do these things for nothing when we're trying to support biodiversity and ecosystem services and different habitat types. I think that's going to be very important. So does anyone have any last things they wanted to say? I think we're getting very close on time. Oh, we're at time. So I'd like to say thank you very much to all of our panelists. There are many things we've covered. We've had some really interesting discussions, and there are many things that we haven't had time to touch on. So maybe we'll have to have a part 2 at some point. So thank you very much, Dr. Jessica Ware, Dr. Margarita Lopez Uribe, and Dr. Alexandra Harman.
Thank you, Nigel.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. It was fun.